Every year, Black History Month celebrates the endless contributions that Black Americans have made to our nation's history. But preserving and teaching Black history goes way beyond this month. It's an important everyday practice. Here are 6 leaders who have dedicated their lives and their work to putting Black history front and center every day. David Stovall is a professor of educational policy studies and African American studies. His research is focused on the influence of race in urban education and community development.
For me, the driving force is, what is that story that we don't talk about? What are those things that have gone missing? And now, what is the responsibility to work with others in bringing those things back?
To get to that level of critical thinking, you got to start asking questions first. What was the moment when you started asking those questions,
Kindergarten.
Kindergarten?
Once I got the bogus Columbus story, 1492, sailed the ocean blue, and my father told me an entirely different story. He said, look, he was trying to find India, but landed in the Bahamas and called folks the wrong name. And in my mind, in my 5-year-old mind, I was just like, well, how do you discover something where people already are? The teacher is lying. Right? So I'm done with this school. This school is just ridiculous. Why are we doing this? And then 4th grade, I had a teacher who was really stern with us and saying, look, the rest of the world is saying all these things about you and have these particular negative expectations of you. What are you going to do to prove them wrong? Right? So for me, it was like, oh, okay. Now this is making sense. Any type of tangible critical analysis, forthright change is directed by people who have found those conditions intolerable and are working to change those conditions.
Cheryl Dunye is a filmmaker and professor exploring the issues of race, class, and gender in the lives of LGBTQ people of color.
So my early work really documents the sort of life that I lived and the life that I did not see in the media that was out there at that time. Luckily, I slipped into a place of being the first African-American lesbian to make the first African-American lesbian feature film, The Watermelon Woman. Filmmaking became this way for me to speak about, who I am and what I believe in, and finding myself in history because I wasn't there. So, I know there's a need for my impact and my storytelling. There's not a lot of African-American lesbians in the art world.
Evelyn Hammonds was the first Black woman to win tenure at MIT, and she was the first woman and Black individual to be named Dean of Harvard College. Her research is focused on the intersections of race, gender, science, and medicine.
One of my long-term projects and commitments is to try to understand the participation of African Americans, women of color, and other groups that are not highly represented in American science, to understand that problem. It's very important for people to really see this as a historical question.
Alan Lee is a former teacher and the Senior Public Programs and Education Manager at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta.
I'm from Conway, South Carolina. My family has been in that area since the plantation, and I grew up going down to the slave cemeteries and cleaning off the graves, and while looking at the big house, that is still there, across the field, and hearing the stories. And so there was always a question of, is what I'm doing big enough, great enough to be worthy of my family's legacy and sacrifice? I knew that I wanted to be involved in something that blended community activism and youth advocacy work.
Effie Brown is a film producer who works to tell Black stories on screen and improve diversity in Hollywood across the board.
I think that we need to be heard, and I think that the world can be saved through stories. I think that, it sounds super simple, but I really and honestly believe that we can solve the world problems through storytelling. Right now, we have been overly indexed in white male dominant culture. So that's why it's so important for me of wherever there is the other. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I'll be like, what do you need? Like, I will amplify your voice, whether it's producing their movies or hooking up or growing a producer, because God knows we need people. Movies that I'm interested in are usually about women, people of color, LGBTQ, and people with disabilities, you know, in front of and behind the camera. Like, that's sort of my jam. Like, anything that's sort of like, this is not your typical movie. They're like, send it to Effie.
Odessa Woolfolk was a teacher at the height of the civil rights movement and later went on to create the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. She works to teach the next generation about civil and human rights by preserving and sharing history.
I was a teacher in 1963 when the civil rights movement in Birmingham reached its crescendo. And several of the students that I taught then went to jail, marched, etc. Now, I'm not all that brave, but there are different ways. For example, if there were a revolution, everybody doesn't have to be on the front line. So I ended up being a teacher. You owe it to yourselves to look deep down inside and see what do you have that you can bring to make it better for somebody else in another generation. Just find a way to tap into doing something for somebody other than yourself.
So which leaders or stories do you want to see uplifted during this Black History Month? Let us know in the comments below.